Jack Whitaker had always believed the land carried its own kind of voice. The wide fields of his family's ranch stretched endlessly, where the grass swayed like waves in the wind, and the sky opened up with colors at sunrise and sunset that no painting could capture. For Jack, this ranch was more than soil and fences. It was his legacy, a gift from generations before him. Life here moved at its own pace. Cattle grazed freely, horses trotted across the pasture, and the creek that ran near the eastern edge of the property sang quietly through the seasons. Each day began before the first light touched the horizon. Jack would walk the fence lines, boots pressing into dew-soaked grass, checking for breaks or signs of coyotes. His hands were rough from years of labor, yet steady and practiced as he mended posts and swung hammers. There was comfort in the rhythm of ranch work, a sense of honesty that came from building a life with his own hands. The nearest town was growing quickly, but here on the ranch, Jack still felt a step removed from the rush of modern demands. Though the land gave him peace, it also demanded respect. Storms could flood the low fields in spring, and long summers often tested his patience with drought. But Jack never complained. He knew the cycles, trusted the soil, and carried the kind of patience only those tied to the land truly understood. His evenings ended by the porch, watching the sun dip low while the cattle gathered by the creek. It was a quiet life, but it was his life. In recent months, however, Jack had noticed changes on the horizon. To the west, beyond the rolling hills, new houses began to appear one after another. The once quiet road now echoed with the sound of construction trucks. A development had sprung up almost overnight, managed by a strict and ambitious homeowners association. Jack had heard stories from neighbors about how the group operated, setting rules on everything from the color of paint to the height of fences. It was a world far removed from his own, yet each day the line between his ranch and their planned community seemed thinner. At first, Jack dismissed it as progress he could not control. The town was growing, people needed homes, and the land beyond his ranch had been sold years ago, but the thought nagged at him, especially when he saw survey crews moving closer to his property line. He tried not to think much of it. After all, his deed was clear, his boundaries were firm, and his land was his sanctuary. Still, a quiet unease settled in his mind. One crisp morning, as Jack saddled his horse to ride the northern ridge, he spotted something unusual. Bright orange flags dotted a stretch of grass that had never been marked before. Wooden stakes were driven into the earth, lined in a straight path across the pasture. His horse shifted restlessly as Jack dismounted to take a closer look. The markings stretched farther than he expected, cutting across open land as though someone had drawn a new boundary without asking. That evening, over a simple meal at his kitchen table, Jack studied the markings again in his memory. They were too precise to be accidental, too organized to be the work of hunters or trespassers. These were construction markers, he was sure of it. But what project would run directly through the middle of his ranch? The question weighed on him, long after the lantern flickered low and the night grew quiet outside. Jack told himself it was nothing, maybe just a mistake that would be corrected soon. Yet deep down, he felt the first stirrings of a storm. His land had always been his shield, his peace, and his freedom. But now, for the first time in years, Jack Whitaker wondered if someone else was beginning to lay claim to what he had worked so hard to protect. The following week, Jack rose early as always, the sun still hidden below the horizon, casting only a faint silver glow across the fields. He planned a simple day, repairing a gate on the south pasture and moving a few cattle closer to the creek. But before he could even saddle his horse, a low rumble carried across the open air. It wasn't the familiar hum of tractors or the sound of his own equipment. This was heavier, mechanical, purposeful. Jack followed the noise and soon caught sight of two trucks parked along his northern boundary. A small crew of workers in reflective vests had spread across the pasture. They were driving stakes into the ground, stringing lines, and reading maps clipped to their boards. His stomach tightened. The orange flags he had seen last week were no mistake. They were the start of something larger. He approached slowly, boots crunching on the dry grass. One of the workers noticed him and gave a quick wave, as though his presence was expected, not questioned. Jack didn't wave back. "Morning," he called firmly as he neared. "What exactly are you doing on my land?" The man with the clipboard stepped forward, adjusting his cap. "Survey work," he answered casually. "We're setting the route for the pipeline." Jack stopped in his tracks. "Pipeline?" His voice carried disbelief. The worker nodded, pointing toward the horizon where the new neighborhood shimmered with fresh rooftops. "Water supply. The development is expanding, and this line will carry what they need. All approved through the association." Jack's jaw tightened. "This is private property. You don't just walk in and start digging trenches across my land." The worker shifted uneasily. "We've got permits on file, easement rights, all legal." Jack shook, his head slowly. His family had worked this land for generations, and never once had he heard of an easement that gave anyone permission to run a pipeline through the middle of his ranch. Before he could argue further, the worker added, "If you've got questions, you'll want to talk to Gregory Steele. He's the president of the association. We're just following orders." That name lingered in Jack's mind long after the crew packed up for the day. He drove into town that afternoon, determined to get answers. The office of the association stood like a monument to order and control, brick walls, polished glass doors, and manicured lawns. Inside, everything smelled of paper, ink, and authority. Gregory Steele greeted him with a practiced smile, the kind that revealed confidence, but not warmth. "Mr. Whitaker, I expected you might come by," Steele said smoothly, motioning toward a chair in his office. Jack remained standing. "Why are there survey crews on my ranch?" Steele leaned back, hands folded on his desk. "Because progress waits for no one. That pipeline is essential for the growth of this community, and fortunately, decades ago, your land was marked with a utility easement. Perfectly legal, I assure you." Jack's brow furrowed. "I've never signed anything, never given permission." "You didn't need to," Steele replied calmly. "It was written long before your ownership. We're simply activating what's already in place." The certainty in Steele's voice pressed against Jack like a weight. The man spoke as though the matter was closed, as though the land he worked and bled for was just another piece on a board to be moved at will. Jack's temper burned, though he kept his voice steady. "That pipeline runs through the heart of my ranch. It disrupts my cattle, damages my fields. You can't expect me to accept this." Steele's smile never wavered. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice. Our lawyers will confirm everything. If you'd like, this project will happen with or without your blessing." The conversation ended there, but the echo of those words followed Jack back home. As he rode across his land that evening, the sight of fresh survey lines cut into his soil felt like scars. His quiet life had been disturbed, his boundaries challenged. And though Steele spoke with confidence, Jack knew one truth deep within him. He would not give up his ranch without a fight. The days that followed felt heavier than usual for Jack Whitaker. He tried to carry on with his chores, moving cattle, repairing fence posts, checking the creek after a light rain, but his mind lingered on the survey lines carved across his pasture. Each bright flag felt like a warning, a reminder that others now saw his land not as a home, but as a corridor for their plans. Jack decided he couldn't stay silent. The next morning, he parked his truck near the construction markers and waited. Before long, the survey crew returned. As their boots sank into the damp soil, Jack stepped forward, calm but firm. "You won't drive a single stake further," he told them. "Not until this matter is settled." The workers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The man with the clipboard finally spoke. "Sir, we're just doing our jobs. If we don't move forward, we'll get calls from the association." "Then let them call me directly," Jack said, his eyes steady. "This is my land, and I'm telling you to stop." The crew packed up more quickly than usual, leaving Jack with a rare moment of satisfaction. But his victory lasted only a day. The following afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside was a letter written in polished legal language, warning him that interfering with the project could result in heavy financial penalties. The tone was cold and precise, carrying the clear message that he was now standing against something far larger than himself. By evening, the trucks were back, larger ones this time, their tires digging deep into his pasture. Jack's cattle scattered at the noise, their calm broken by the intrusion. He hurried to the field, waving his arms, shouting for the drivers to stop. Some did, others didn't, their engines drowning out his voice. Dust filled the air as the machines rolled past, and Jack's heart pounded with a mix of anger and helplessness. Word spread quickly among his neighbors. Some whispered advice, telling him not to fight a battle that couldn't be won. They reminded him of other ranchers and homeowners who had resisted the association in the past, only to be buried in legal fees until they gave in. Others offered quiet support, but admitted they were afraid to get involved. That night, Jack sat on his porch, staring into the distance. The stars above shone steady, but everything beneath them felt unsettled. He thought about his father, who had built this ranch from near nothing, and his grandfather, who had broken the first soil with his own hands. They had faced storms, droughts, and hardships, but never had they been forced to surrender their land to outsiders. Jack knew running headlong into court would drain him faster than any storm ever could. The association had money, lawyers, and influence. But what they didn't have, he reminded himself, was his patience or his resolve. He needed a different kind of plan, one that would turn the balance back in his favor. In the following days, he began to watch more closely. He studied the crews, noted the direction of their lines, and traced their maps in his mind. He visited the county office, combing through records late into the afternoon. He found old documents, land deeds, and permits. Most of it confirmed what Steele had said. There was indeed an easement written long ago. But there was also something else, a detail that caught Jack's attention. The development's expansion depended on a single supply of water, routed through a spring just outside the association's boundary. The thought lodged itself firmly in his mind. If the association's strength rested on that water, perhaps that was where he needed to look. Jack closed the dusty county record book with a decisive thump. For the first time since the survey flags appeared, he felt the faint spark of an idea. He didn't know yet how far it would take him, but he knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't going to let anyone turn his ranch into a pipeline without giving them a fight they would not forget. The next morning, Jack Whitaker returned to the county office, a place he had only visited a handful of times in his life. Usually, his world stayed within the borders of his ranch. But now, those borders had been crossed, and answers could only be found in paperwork and records. He asked to see the files related to the new development, the association's permits, and anything tied to the pipeline project. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the unusual request, but pulled the thick folders anyway. Jack sat at a wooden desk in the back corner, flipping through pages of maps, stamped approvals, and typed contracts. It felt overwhelming at first. Legal words stretched across every page, some of them foreign to him. Still, he had patience, and more importantly, he had determination. Slowly, a picture began to form. The association's plans were larger than Jack expected. Entire sections of land were marked for future neighborhoods, all lined neatly with roads and dotted with small parks. And running like veins across the maps was the proposed pipeline, cutting straight through his ranch before, feeding into the grid. Jack's jaw tightened as he traced the bold line that crossed his pasture. Then his eyes fell on a smaller note in the corner of one map. The development's water allocation came from a single source, a natural spring that fed into a creek, just beyond the association's land. Jack recognized the name of the property owner, Evelyn Price, a woman in her late 70s who had lived quietly on her acreage for decades. He remembered seeing her at town gatherings, kind and soft-spoken, always talking about her love for the land and the water that had been her family's lifeline. A thought struck Jack with sudden clarity. The association's expansion might look unstoppable, but it had a weakness. Without control of that spring, their entire project would struggle. The water was the lifeblood of everything they planned, and as of now, it didn't belong to them. Jack leaned back in the chair, the weight of the discovery sinking in. For the first time in weeks, he felt the scales begin to shift. He didn't have lawyers or influence, but he could have something far more powerful, control of the resource that the association couldn't do without. Later that evening, Jack visited Evelyn Price's property. Her land sat on a gentle rise, where the spring bubbled from the earth, clear and steady, before trickling down into a wider stream. Evelyn greeted him warmly at her gate, surprised by his unexpected arrival. They sat on her porch, sipping sweet tea as the sun lowered behind the trees. Jack explained the situation carefully, choosing his words with respect. He spoke about the pipeline, the survey crews, and the pressure the association was placing on his ranch. Evelyn listened closely, her lined face calm but thoughtful. When Jack mentioned the spring and its importance, her eyes softened. "I've always known they'd come knocking one day," she said quietly. "Water like this doesn't go unnoticed forever." Jack hesitated before asking the question. "Have they approached you already?" Evelyn nodded. "They've sent letters, made offers. Nice numbers on paper, but selling this land has never been in my heart. My parents raised me here. I was born within earshot of that spring. Letting it go would feel like letting go of everything they left behind." Her words struck a chord in Jack. He understood that feeling better than most. Still, he pressed gently. "If you ever decided to pass it on, it should be to someone who will protect it, not exploit it." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity in his eyes. Finally, she said, "If I do choose to sell, it won't be to them. It'll be to someone who understands what this water means." As Jack drove back to his ranch under a sky filled with stars, his mind raced. The association thought they had the upper hand with easements and lawyers. But they had overlooked something vital. The heart of their project lay outside their reach. If Jack could secure the spring, he would hold the leverage they never expected. The path forward wouldn't be simple. It would take patience, money, and trust. But for the first time since the survey stakes appeared, Jack felt the weight on his shoulders ease. There was hope, and it flowed as clear and steady as the spring itself. For days after his visit with Evelyn Price, Jack Whitaker could think of little else but the spring. Every chore on the ranch seemed to circle back to it, the sound of water running through his own creek, the way his cattle gathered near it during the heat of summer, the quiet life it supported. He realized now that the same kind of flow held the fate of the association's grand project. Without the spring, their pipeline was just an empty shell. Jack didn't rush to Evelyn immediately. He knew a decision like hers couldn't be pushed. Instead, he spent the next week preparing. He met with a local banker he trusted, explained that he wanted to make a serious purchase, and reviewed his finances carefully. It would not be easy. Buying Evelyn's land meant stretching himself further than he had in years. But he also knew opportunities like this came once in a lifetime. One evening, he returned to Evelyn's porch. The same spring breeze carried, the scent of wildflowers across her fields, and the sound of the bubbling water filled the silence between them. They spoke for hours, not just about business, but about family, memories, and the meaning of land that holds history. Evelyn told stories of her childhood, chasing fireflies by the water, carrying pails during dry summers, and the lessons her parents taught her about never taking the spring for granted. Finally, Jack made his offer. "Evelyn," he said gently, "I know you've held on to this land because it matters to you. And I promise you, if I buy it, I won't let it be destroyed. I'll care for it the way you and your family have. The association doesn't see the spring the way we do. They only see numbers. But to us, it's life." Evelyn's eyes filled with emotion, and she placed her hand over his. "I believe you, Jack, and if it must pass to anyone, I want it to be you." The agreement took several weeks to finalize. Papers had to be signed, funds transferred, and records updated at the county office. But at last, it was official. Jack Whitaker was now the owner of Evelyn Price's land, including the spring that fed the association's development. The moment he held the deed in his hands, Jack felt the weight of the fight shift. For the first time, he wasn't only defending his ranch, he was holding the very key to the future of the association's plans. He wasted no time securing the spring. With the help of a local fencing company, he built a sturdy boundary around the property and posted clear signs of private ownership. He set up locks on the access road and made sure the land was protected from any casual trespassing. He even brought his nephew, an eager college student studying environmental management, to help test and document the water quality. When word reached the association, their reaction was swift. Gregory Steele himself called Jack within days. The smooth confidence in his voice was gone, replaced by sharp urgency. "Whitaker," Steele said tightly, "I understand you've purchased property near the spring." "That's correct," Jack answered evenly. "You should know that water is essential to the community we're building. We're prepared to make you an offer that more than covers what you paid." Jack's reply was firm. "It's not for sale, not to you, not at any price." There was a long silence on the line, followed by Steele's clipped words. "You're making a mistake. We'll see about that." Jack hung up, his resolve stronger than ever. He knew retaliation would come. The association would not sit quietly after losing control of such a critical resource. But Jack also knew something else. For the first time, he wasn't simply reacting to their moves. He had taken the initiative, and with the spring under his protection, he held the upper hand. That night, as he walked the land near the bubbling water, Jack felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. The spring was safe. Evelyn's trust was honored, and the association's unchecked march across the countryside had finally met a boundary they couldn't cross. Jack Whitaker had known from the start that buying the spring would not end the struggle. It would only begin a new chapter. Still, the speed at which the association retaliated surprised even him. Within days of the purchase, he began receiving letters. Each one arrived in a crisp envelope, written in polished legal terms, but the meaning was always the same. The association was challenging his ownership, demanding access, or hinting at lawsuits. At first, Jack read them carefully, making notes in the margins. Then, as more letters piled up, he set them aside. He understood the tactic. They wanted to overwhelm him, to make him second-guess himself, to wear down his patience. But Jack was a man who had spent his life facing storms, droughts, and long winters. Patience was his strength, and no stack of paper could change that. When the letters failed to move him, other tactics followed. One night, he heard the distant rumble of engines near the spring. By the time he reached the property, fresh tire tracks marked the soil around his fence. The gate lock had been tampered with, though not broken. Whoever had come had left in a hurry. Jack replaced the lock the next morning and set up a motion camera hidden among the trees. A few days later, he discovered one of his water troughs tipped over and his cattle scattered across the pasture, spooked by something in the night. He spent hours calming them and repairing the damage. He knew these incidents weren't coincidences. They were reminders, carefully staged, that the association was watching him, pressuring him, trying to push him toward surrender. But Jack also knew something they didn't. He was documenting everything. Every letter, every trespass, every unusual disturbance was recorded. His nephew helped organize the files, storing photographs and video clips in a secure drive. If the day came when he needed to stand before a judge, Jack wanted to be ready with facts, not just frustration. Meanwhile, Gregory Steele made another attempt at persuasion. This time, it was not through paper or late-night trespass, but in person. Steele arrived at Jack's ranch one afternoon in a polished black car, stepping out in a tailored suit that looked out of place against the dust and grass. "Mr. Whitaker," Steele greeted, his tone still calm but strained. "I think we've both wasted enough time. Let's speak plainly." Jack folded his arms, saying nothing. Steele gestured toward the fields. "You've done well, I'll admit. Securing the spring was a clever move. But surely you see this is temporary. Our association has resources you can't match. Lawyers, investors, government contacts. You can't stand against us forever." Jack's eyes narrowed. "I don't need forever. I only need the law on my side. And as of now, that water belongs to me." Steele's smile was thin. "Name your price. Whatever you paid, we'll double it. Triple it if that's what it takes." Jack shook his head slowly. "This isn't about price. It's about principle. You'll never own that spring as long as I'm here." For the first time, Steele's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his voice sharpened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Whitaker. This won't end well for you." But Jack remained steady. "The only danger is believing you can push people around without limits." Steele turned on his heel and left without another word, the hum of his car fading into the distance. That night. Jack stood by the spring, listening to the water flow steady and sure. He knew more challenges were coming. The association would not give up easily. But for every threat they sent, for every shadow cast across his land, Jack's resolve only grew stronger. The spring was not just water, it was proof that even one man could draw a line no association could cross. And though the fight was far from finished, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: control. For the first time since the survey flags appeared on his ranch, the balance of power had shifted. Weeks passed, and the conflict between Jack Whitaker and the association grew into something larger than either had expected. What began as a private battle over survey stakes had become the talk of the town. People whispered about Jack's stand against the powerful association, about the spring he now owned, and about the project that seemed to stall more each day. Contractors who had once moved confidently across Jack's pasture now stood idle, their equipment parked along the roadside. Without guaranteed access to the spring, the pipeline couldn't advance beyond the planning stage. Investors who had poured money into the development began to grow restless, questioning whether Steele's leadership could deliver on its promises. Jack noticed the change, subtle at first, then more obvious. Where once the association seemed unshakable, cracks now showed in its foundation. Steele continued to send letters, but their tone had shifted. They were less confident, more urgent, as though time was slipping through his grasp. It was during this tense period that the town announced a public meeting. The subject: concerns over water rights, development plans, and the impact on surrounding properties. Jack knew immediately this was his moment. For weeks he had endured pressure in silence. Now he would have the chance to speak openly. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been brushed aside by the association's demands. On the night of the meeting, the town hall filled quickly. Residents packed the wooden benches, their voices low but expectant. Some were association members, eager to defend their neighborhood. Others were longtime locals, curious to see how one rancher could stand against such a well-funded group. At the front sat Gregory Steele, his polished confidence dimmed but not extinguished. When Jack's name was called, he rose from his seat. The room quieted as he stepped to the podium. He placed a folder of documents on the surface, but his voice carried more weight than the papers ever could. "My name is Jack Whitaker," he began steadily. "My family has worked the land west of here for generations. When the survey crews arrived on my ranch without warning, I learned that a pipeline was planned to cut straight through my fields. I was told it was legal, that I had no choice. But what I discovered since then tells a different story." He opened the folder, holding up maps and deeds. "This development depends on water from a spring that, as of now, belongs to me. I purchased it legally, with the blessing of its former owner, who trusted me to protect it. I have every right to control how that water is used. The association may have influence, but influence does not replace ownership." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Steele shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jack continued, his voice stronger now. "This isn't about stopping growth. It's about respect. Respect for the people who have worked this land long before new roads were paved. Respect for boundaries, for fairness, for the law. I won't stand by while anyone assumes they can take what isn't theirs." When he finished, the room erupted in quiet applause. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, growing as more hands joined in. Neighbors who had once whispered their doubts now showed their support openly. Even those tied to the association sat in uneasy silence, realizing Steele's promises might no longer hold weight. Steele rose next, trying to defend the project, but his words lacked the certainty they once carried. He spoke of progress, of community needs, of the future. Yet every sentence seemed thinner than the last, especially compared to Jack's simple honesty. By the end of the meeting, the message was clear. The association's project could not proceed without Jack's cooperation, and Jack was not backing down. As Jack walked out into the cool night air, neighbors stopped to shake his hand, offering words of encouragement. For the first time, he saw the power of his stand reflected not just in documents or fences, but in the respect of the community around him. The pipeline had not yet been officially canceled, but Jack knew the momentum had shifted. What once looked inevitable now teetered on collapse, and deep down, he sensed that the final victory was within reach. In the weeks after the town hall meeting, the effects of Jack Whitaker's stand became impossible to ignore. Where once the association's project moved with certainty, now it stood frozen. Contractors withdrew their crews, citing unresolved water access. Investors, frustrated by delays, pulled back their funding. And homeowners who had placed deposits on new lots demanded answers that Gregory Steele could no longer provide. The polished confidence Steele had carried into every conversation began to fade. Reports spread of heated arguments behind closed doors, of board members questioning his decisions, of mounting legal fees draining the association's resources. For the first time, Steele's voice no longer sounded like authority. It sounded desperate. Meanwhile, Jack carried on with his life as he always had. He rose with the dawn, tended his cattle, and walked the fence lines of his ranch. Yet something had changed. Neighbors who once warned him not to fight stopped by to shake his hand. Folks at the feed store offered him quiet nods of respect. He had not only defended his land, but shown others that even one man, standing steady, could make a difference. It wasn't without challenges. Steele sent one final letter, threatening to escalate the matter to higher courts. But by then, Jack's careful records, every photograph, every trespass report, every signed deed, were neatly organized and ready. The association knew that pursuing the fight further would expose their tactics and likely cost them more than they could afford. The letter remained unanswered, and no more followed. As spring turned to summer, the fields around Jack's ranch flourished. The grass grew tall, the cattle grazed contently, and the creek ran clear. The spring he had purchased from Evelyn Price bubbled steadily, its waters flowing strong. Jack often walked the boundary of that property, leaning on the fence posts. He had sat, watching the sunlight dance on the rippling surface. He thought of Evelyn often and the trust she had placed in him. Protecting the spring wasn't just strategy, it was a promise fulfilled. The town, too, felt the shift. With the pipeline halted, expansion slowed. Some grumbled at the delay, but many more felt relief. The unchecked pace of development had begun to overwhelm the quiet charm of the area, and Jack's stand reminded people that not all growth was worth the cost. Conversations in cafes and shops carried a different tone now, more cautious, more thoughtful, more respectful of the land that had been here long before new neighborhoods appeared. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and crimson, Jack sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea. The cattle moved lazily in the pasture, and the sound of the creek carried softly through the warm air. For the first time in months, he felt true peace. He thought back on everything. The surprise of the survey crews, the long nights of worry, the steady pressure from Steele and his lawyers. He remembered the fear that his land might slip away under paperwork he hadn't signed, and the determination that rose in him when he realized he had to fight back. It had been a hard road, but he had stood firm, and in the end, the land was. Still his, untouched, unbroken. The phone rang just as the last light faded. It was his nephew, calling to say he had been accepted into a graduate program for environmental management. He wanted to study water conservation, inspired by everything he had seen Jack do. Jack's chest swelled with quiet pride. Perhaps the fight hadn't only saved his ranch, it had sparked something new for the next generation. As night settled, Jack leaned back in his chair and looked across the wide horizon. The stars blinked into view one by one, steady and sure, just as they always had. The ranch, the spring, the creek, the cattle, everything was in its place. The association had come with plans, with money, with confidence. But in the end, they had underestimated something stronger. The will of a man who understood that land is not just property. It is life, memory, and freedom. And as the water flowed on, steady and clear, Jack Whitaker knew he had not only defended his ranch, he had restored his peace.